Hi, I'm Dr. Selena Fisk, and welcome to this episode of Make Data Talk. In this podcast, I help you turn your spreadsheets into stories in a way that is practical, accessible, and hopefully a whole lot more useful than your grade 9 maths textbook. Today, I'm going to be talking about my evidence versus action model. You might have seen it on social media, and it'll be in the show notes for today's episode. But I'm going to talk through that. I'm going to share some strategies with you for how you can move more of your people, or maybe even yourself, into the impact quadrant. I use this model in my work all of the time. If you're out walking or listening to this while you're driving, you're going to have to think along as I talk you through the model. The image will also be available in the show notes, and the episode artwork for today is this model. There are two axes. Across the page, running left to right, is the action continuum. Running from the top to the bottom of the page is the evidence continuum, and they intersect right in the middle of one another. And so what we're left with is 4 even quadrants in the top right, top left, and bottom right. Let's just talk about the continuums first of all. Everyone sits somewhere on the evidence continuum that runs from the top to the bottom of the image. When I use the term evidence in this context, I'm referring to both the data that's collected within our organisations and in our teams, so our internal data, but also the evidence that's coming from outside of our organisations. So that might be the most relevant and up-to-date research that's indicating what practices might be effective. It might be case studies of local or similar businesses or organisations who face similar challenges. And it's a combination of those two things. So the internal data and then the external research evidence. And we all fit somewhere on that continuum. So if we're in the top half of that continuum, we're regularly accessing and reflecting on both the internal and external evidence that we have. But if we're in the bottom half of this model, we're not really using it very much at all. In some cases, I've met people who are very good at looking at their internal data, so they're looking at one and not the other. And I've also met people who are very good at understanding the research and what local case studies are telling them and what has been successful for similar businesses and organisations in a similar field, but they're not very good at looking at their internal data. So to be above the line and to be in the top half of this model, you need to be tapping in and using both the internal and the research evidence. The horizontal axis then relates to action, so the amount of action that we're going to take or how responsive we are to the evidence that we have access to. On the left-hand side, we deal with people who don't really act and who are often doing the same thing that they've maybe always done before, or they're repeating patterns and they're kind of going about their business not relying on or not tapping into what that internal or the research evidence is telling them. People over on the right-hand side of this model, though, they are taking action. They're trying things out. They're trying to be responsive. They're trying to adapt to the environment, to the data, to the evidence that they have, and they're trying new things. So the goal is certainly to move to the right-hand side. So in this model, we want to be moving up the evidence continuum towards the top of the model and to the right where we're taking action and we're being quite responsive. So this quadrant model ends up splitting the page into 4 even sections. I'm going to talk about the one in the bottom left first, and that's called stasis. When people are in stasis, they're using very little evidence and they're taking very little action. So I can think of a handful of people, and this is absolutely the minority in our organisations and in our teams. I can think of a handful of people that I've worked with in my lifetime who've literally said the words to me, Selena, I've done this for the last 20 years. It's worked for me up to this point. Why would I change it now? So if you've ever heard that from anybody in your workplace, I would absolutely say that they're in stasis. They're doing the same thing year in, year out, quarter in, quarter out, regardless of the changing dynamic, different clients, the changing economic or financial landscape, whatever it might be. They're just plugging away, trying to do the same thing that they've always done. Thankfully, that is the minority of people, and I'm going to talk a little bit more later on about how we get them out of that and how we start to move them, because while they are the minority, ideally we don't want them staying there. Occasionally, I work with people who are in the bottom right-hand corner of this quadrant model. So they're not really tapping into the evidence that they have access to, but they are actually being responsive. And this is quite an interesting space to work in, because these are people that are often really well-intentioned, and they're trying hard, like they're trying to make a difference. They're trying to be responsive to what the climate, the clients, whoever it is that they're serving, whatever they need, or they're trying to respond to a challenge in their business, but they're using very little evidence to actually inform the actions that they're taking. I call this quadrant guesswork, and it really is guesswork, because they're guessing what is potentially going to be successful in that context. And they're not relying on, say, case studies, research, or what the internal data is telling them. I've worked with a couple of organisations in this guesswork quadrant, not too many, to be honest. There's more in this quadrant than Stasis, but not huge numbers. The first type that I have seen and worked with was people who understood their internal data really well, but then the actions that they took weren't research informed. And inevitably what happened was they reached out to me because they said, we have all this internal data and we've seen these patterns and the trends, and they were actually really articulate about the problems that they were seeing within their business. But then the actions that they chose didn't actually align with best practice, or didn't align with what other case studies or other businesses would have done. It was, in some ways, I almost look at the actions that they took, and I really struggled to connect the dots between what they think they needed and what they did, and why they chose the things that they did. So that's one version where they're very good at their internal but not great with the external. The other is a flip of that. So I've worked with people who are really good at the research evidence and not very good at looking at their internal data. And what it's meant is that, research is really helpful, and different case studies are so helpful to indicate what our next steps could be. But we have to understand the context and the climate that we're working in our organizations and teams. And we have to understand that data that's being generated by our people, because if we try and act in a different way, if we try and be responsive, if we try and shake things up, but actually our internal data is, if we'd looked at it, is indicating that things don't need to change, or that actually people need something different to what we were anticipating, then again, that's why we're in this quadrant of guesswork. Like, we're literally trying to guess what actions will fit and best suit the needs of our people, our teams, and the people that we're trying to serve. More often than not, I meet and work with people who are in the top left quadrant, which I call lost opportunity. People in that quadrant are using evidence, so they've got access to a lot of internal and external evidence, which is really good, but they're not taking action. So they're really low on the action continuum over on the left. They're not using the information in the best ways that they possibly can. So hence the name, the lost opportunity. Sometimes people are here because they fear taking action. They're worried about, what if I try something and I get it wrong and it fails, or it doesn't work, it's not successful? What's the impact or the fallout going to be for me? And other times people really, they don't know how to act. So they've got the evidence in front of them. And for some people, it's almost, they're in this lost opportunity quadrant because of, you would have heard the saying analysis paralysis. They're almost so heavily in the weeds of the data and the research that they have that they don't or can't kind of zoom out and think about, well, okay, so what do we now do with that? Or what's the so what of knowing this information? The goal is to move people into the quadrant that sits in the top right of this model, which is the impact quadrant. So this is where people have access to really good internal evidence and data, and they're tapping into research and best practice, and they're being responsive to that information. So it's absolutely the goal to get to the impact quadrant. And I guess I've certainly worked with people who feel that they've just crept into the quadrant. They've just kind of made it over the lines, whichever one it might be. I've worked with people who are very close to the action, who are kind of quite close to the middle continuum. This is really hard to explain to you without you being able to see the image, but they're just over to the right-hand side of the line, but they're quite high in terms of their use of evidence. And I've met people who are just over the horizontal axis in terms of the amount of evidence they're tapping into, but they're a long way to the right. So they're being really responsive and they're trying to take action. It doesn't matter where you fit in this quadrant, how confidently you have moved into it or how far in you are. It's just a useful way of reflecting on both where you think you sit, but also where do the people that you work with sit, and how do we support them to get into this impact quadrant? The main thing for me, when people are being responsive to the evidence that they have and they're taking action and they're trying the things, the main thing for me that I guess really differentiates people who get this and people who are struggling with it still is that people who get it understand that this is never going to be perfect. The actions that we take are never, or they're very, very rarely going to have a very clear cut and clean output. In most cases, for most people listening to this podcast, we're dealing with complex human beings in complex systems. So it's never going to be as simple as saying, this is what the data is telling me. I'm going to tweak this thing and therefore the output is going to be better or the output's going to be improved on the other end. If only life was that simple. It's not. Life is not that simple. It's certainly a lot more grey. So what people who are, I guess, succeeding in the impact quadrant and who are really confident in this space, what they're doing is they're able to say, do you know what? I'm trying this thing because the research is indicating that this is a really good potential solution. I can see internally that this is what my team, my people, my clients, the community, whatever it is, what they need. And I'm going to try this thing. And if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. And obviously we want it to be successful. But often what we see happen in data and evidence-informed change processes is that it might work for some and not others. It might work in certain contexts and not others. It might work on some days or one quarter and not another. So people who are really kind of confident in this impact space understand that this is not about perfection. This is not about achieving this set desired outcome and you either achieve it or you don't. They're hanging in that grey and they're learning from the opportunity or the times that things don't work or where it only works for some and not others. They're just learning from that. And that's just more evidence, more data, more of that internal information that's giving you feedback about what your people and your teams and your communities and clients actually need. I was having a really interesting conversation with somebody yesterday and she was talking about failure and she was saying failure is actually good. And with the conversation we were having, I said, is it failure? Is it failure if we know our people need something, if we do the research, if we do the work and we try something out and it doesn't work, is that actually failure? Or have we just learnt something? I know there's so many cliches about failing forward and all that type of thing. But I just really struggle to conceptualize how that's failing when actually what we're getting out of that is a far better understanding of what our people need and what might be likely to work or less likely to work for them in the future. Like that's absolutely gold. That's more data. That's more evidence that's telling me what my people need. And so the goal is certainly to be in that impact and hold those actions and take those actions with conviction and having done the work, but also holding them really lightly and being able to look at them more objectively. So the goal is to get people into the impact quadrant. And that might be, you might be thinking about this for you. It might be for people that you work with, whatever it might be. I want to talk about the people on the bottom of this model first. So the people who are in stasis, they need to get better at using the evidence and they need to get better at action. What we can't do is we can't build their skill in both of those things straight away. We also can't move them diagonally from the bottom left-hand corner to the top right-hand corner. We can't do that at the same time. So we've got to move one way first. If somebody's in stasis, what we want to do is build their understanding and use of the evidence. We want to build their confidence and capability with being able to see what's happening internally and what is the research saying. So with people in stasis, actually for both groups in the bottom half of this model, we actually actively need to think about how do we build their capacity with evidence. For stasis, if we can do that for those people in stasis, we're moving them straight up the model into the lost opportunity quadrant. We're not there yet. We're not done with them, but at least they're understanding what's available to them. At least they're understanding what good practice looks like. If we can move, so now think about the people in the bottom right-hand corner, which was the guesswork quadrant. If we can build their understanding of the evidence and we get to move them up the continuum, that's a really quick win because we can get them into that impact quadrant pretty quickly. In some ways, that's the easiest move. Because if people are trying to take action and trying new things, they're really responsive. In some ways, that approach is harder to teach than teaching about evidence. So if if we can teach them about the evidence, like they're there, like they're keen, they're doing their things, they're trying to make a difference. And so for many of our people in Guesswork, that's a relatively easy shift and move up. But either way, people who are in the bottom 2 quadrants below the line, we want to be able to build their skill, capacity, confidence, and give them the time and the support that they need to look at both the internal and the external evidence. We've then got people sitting in lost opportunity, so over on the left-hand side, and we want ideally to be able to get them into the impact quadrant. As I kind of mentioned before, some of the hurdles that these people face are fear about action, and also maybe not even knowing how to take action or where to take action, or they could just be really stuck in the weeds. There's a couple of things we can do for these people and for ourselves. The first one is really making it clear that you're not expecting that action to be a perfect outcome every time. And maybe it is reframing the idea that actually, if we try something and we learn that it's not going to work or it doesn't work in our context, that actually that's just more internal data and evidence that builds a more robust picture and an understanding of where our organisation or our team is at. And that's actually really powerful. For some people there, I've had people say to me, look, Selena, I'm actually not allowed to act. I'm quite micromanaged by my leader. I have very clear parameters about what I do when I do it, and I'm not allowed to make change. And look, that is a huge lost opportunity, hence the name of that quadrant. That's not an ideal work culture to be in anyway. But my challenge to you, if you've got people like that, like how do we bring those people along on this journey? How do we encourage them to be responsive to the information? If they want to try new things, how do we allow that? How do we allow the time and the space and the acceptance that it may not work, but we learn from it, and encourage them to do so? Because I've been frustrated in workplaces, and I work with people every day who say similar things to me. Frustrated when you can see a gap or you can see a need, and for whatever reason, you feel like you're not allowed to act, or you're told that you're not allowed to act or respond to that. It's really frustrating, and it's certainly not an ideal work environment. There's a couple of ways that we can, I guess, promote and encourage this type of innovation. There's organisations that I work with that run action research cycles. So people are allowed to come with a hypothesis. So they have, I guess, a perception about what's going on. And then they start to do some digging into what a solution could be or what next steps could be. And then they take action. And as a team, they're looking at the response and the impact of their actions alongside the hypothesis, and they're hypothesis testing the whole time. And then they're reflecting on the impact, they're taking the actions, and they're constantly reflecting and refining on what they're doing. Not every industry allows that, granted, but it allows so much more autonomy around the actions. And then when things do go really well, it's an opportunity for celebration, for recognition of staff, because they've seen something, they've come with a problem and they've tried to address it, and they've really actively done something about it. One of the other things we can do to support people, so earlier I mentioned the fact that some people stay in lost opportunity because of real analysis paralysis. We've got a role to play in getting them out of the weeds, whether that be drawing a line in the sand and saying, we need you to make some decisions about what these major trends and insights are in the data, and then we need to talk about actions. I think about my 2 data storytelling questions. The first one is that, what are the trends and the insights? And then the second question is, what do we do about it? We've got a key role to play in organisations when we work with people in lost opportunity. We've got to drag them out of that first question around what are the trends and the insights in the data. We want to be dragging them into the action quadrant or action question so we can get them into the impact quadrant. So prompting, scaffolded questions, forcing them to make some decisions about what those most important trends and insights are. Often people fear that they're going to miss something or they have missed something, and that's why they don't. That's why they won't make a decision. You've just got to allow and give permission for the fact that, they've done the work, they've invested the time and effort in looking at the trends and insights. We just need them to commit. And again, if you're holding that impact and action quadrant really lightly, then that's far more likely to be conducive to people taking those next steps and thinking about what's possible, as opposed to getting stuck in the weeds. So that was a bit of a longer one today. I hope you enjoyed that. I will make the image available in the show notes for you to download, but it will also be the artwork for today's episode. If you appreciated this episode, there's more information about that quadrant model in my book, I'm Not a Numbers Person, but it'd be awesome for you to be able to share this episode with other people that you think might find it interesting and useful. And as always, I'd really appreciate any ratings that you could give because, data, right? The podcasting platforms love it. As always, thanks for listening and stay safe.